Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're heading into the heart of the Aztec Empire, a civilization known for monumental pyramids, intricate calendars, and a dinner menu that occasionally featured people. Aztec cuisine wasn't just about nourishment, it was about ritual, hierarchy, and reminding you that you were always just a few wrong moves away from being the special of the day. Before we wade elbow deep into tamales stuffed with lizard meat and chocolate drinks that taste like bitter regret, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy falling asleep to calm descriptions of ancient oddities. Leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's fascinating to see who's tuning in from around the world. Now take a deep breath, close your eyes, and prepare to explore the glory of the Aztec world. One sacred corn cake, blistering chili pepper, and suspicious stew at a time. In the heart of the Aztec Empire, the grand city of Tenochtitlan pulsed with life. It was built on a lake, literally, with streets made of water and gardens that floated. It had temples that scraped the clouds, and marketplaces large enough to make a Roman forum look like a village garage sale. Historians like to describe Tenochtitlan as clean, orderly, and shockingly advanced, which is true, but they rarely tell you what it smelled like. The air was thick with the kind of scent that clings to your clothes and refuses to leave. Earth and ash, blood and sweat, incense and rot, a heady perfume of civilization at its most functional. At the market, vendors shouted over each other, offering tamales wrapped in corn husks, steaming piles of roasted insects, and stew that bubbled with an oily sheen you didn't want to think too hard about. Somewhere in the chaos, someone was grilling a whole salamander. That wasn't metaphor. It was an axolotl, wide-eyed and unblinking, even in death, turning slowly on a stick. Next to it, a basket overflowed with grasshoppers, roasted to a crisp and seasoned with lime. A man with no shoes and an enormous smile offered them by the handful, like peanuts. His teeth were stained red from chewing something he probably wasn't selling. This was not the sanitized version of pre-Columbian life, the one with golden temples and perfectly aligned sun calendars. This was the real Aztec Empire, messy, loud, and culinary, in a way that walked a fine line between brilliant and borderline psychotic. The food wasn't just weird for the sake of weird. It was functional, deeply symbolic, and sometimes disturbingly efficient. Everything had a place. Every part of the animal, insect, or former person was used. Waste was a foreign concept. So were refrigerators. The markets of Tenochtitlan were organized by food type, a practical touch that made navigating the chaos slightly more bearable. One area was reserved for maize in all its divine, monotonous glory. Another section overflowed with herbs, some fragrant and some so pungent they made your eyes water from 20 paces. You could follow your nose to the fish section, where slabs of freshwater creatures lay flaking in the sun, flies dancing joyfully across their faces. Beside them sat baskets of eels, frogs, and other squirming things that defied easy categorization. If it moved, it was food. If it didn't move yet, it would. The chili section was less a food stall and more a weaponized spice rack. There were red chilies, green chilies, blackened chilies, and ones so potent they could strip the lining from your soul. These weren't delicate seasonings, they were culinary power tools, and they found their way into almost everything. Sometimes even dessert, though dessert was a loose term in a world without sugar, cream, or hope. Over it all, the temples loomed. At the top of the Templo Mayor, priests performed rituals that involved sharp obsidian blades and generous bloodshed. To the Aztecs, food was never just food. It was an offering, a cycle, a promise to the gods that life would go on, preferably with the right spices. The crops grew because the gods had been fed. The rains came because hearts had been offered. It was a transactional relationship, but a consistent one. You gave a little life, you got some corn. Fair enough. For the average citizen, all of this was perfectly normal. They walked through the markets with practiced indifference, stepping over puddles of spilled sauce and ducking under swinging cages filled with live animals that would not be live for much longer. Children begged for pieces of honeyed cactus or crunched happily on roasted ants. Grandmothers haggled over the price of frog legs. And somewhere, a merchant tried to convince a wary customer that, yes, the human-shaped bread was just symbolic. Probably. This was a world where death was close, but food was closer. The Aztec people didn't have domesticated livestock in the way Europe did. There were no cows, no pigs, no sheep. Instead, they got creative. Dogs were bred for companionship and for stewing. Turkeys were raised for feathers and for roasting. Insects were collected with reverence. Amphibians were farmed with care. And humans, well, let's just say the culinary line between offering an entree got a little blurry during festival season. But before we get into the more unsettling aspects of Aztec cuisine, and don't worry, we will, take a moment to appreciate the sheer ingenuity of it all. This was a civilization that fed millions without wheat, without dairy, without metal tools, or beasts of burden. They grew crops on floating gardens, preserved food without salt mines, and flavoured it all with a level of spice that would make a modern hot sauce company blush. Their cuisine was vibrant, efficient, and utterly alien. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. Of course, that doesn't mean you'd want to eat any of it. In the Aztec world, food didn't just fill your stomach. It fulfilled cosmic obligations. Eating was never just about staying alive. It was a spiritual transaction, a ceremonial act, and occasionally an apology to the gods for existing. Meals were more than meals. They were offerings, reenactments, and, depending on the time of year, thinly veiled sacrifices. And yes, sometimes not so thinly veiled ones. The Aztecs didn't separate the sacred from the everyday. They folded them into a tamale and served it hot. The Aztec calendar wasn't just a scheduling tool. It was a recipe book for divine satisfaction. With 18 months of 20 days each, plus a handful of ominous, nameless days for good measure, the year was packed with festivals, each dedicated to a different god. And each god, in turn, had particular cravings. Some wanted maize and flowers. Others demanded blood, hearts, or the occasional flayed corpse. You didn't argue with these preferences. You just showed up with the right dish, or someone else's head rolled for the oversight. Maize, the undisputed starch champion of Mesoamerica, wasn't just food, it was flesh. According to Aztec myth, the gods created humanity from ground corn mixed with divine blood, essentially crafting people out of tortilla dough and violence. This made every tamale a theological event. To eat maize was to consume the body of your ancestor and your god at the same time. Catholicism would later adopt a similar idea, minus the chili sauce. But the Aztecs got there first, and theirs came wrapped in banana leaves. The gods were not known for their moderation. Take Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god, who needed daily doses of fresh blood to keep the sun rising. He didn't ask for much, just the hearts of captured warriors, sliced out ceremonially atop a pyramid and presented still steaming. Sometimes, bits of the honoured sacrifice were cooked afterward and shared among the elite. Not out of hunger, really, more as a gesture. Like communion, but significantly harder to digest. Even seemingly innocent dishes had sacred meanings. Amaranth, a grain rich in nutrients and suspicion, was often used to make edible effigies of the gods. Priests would mould the mixture into humanoid forms, sometimes adding a touch of blood for realism, and then ritually kill the figure before distributing pieces of it to the crowd. This act symbolized renewal, gratitude, and in some cases a mild case of nausea. But it wasn't considered morbid. It was part of the cosmic balance. The gods gave, the people ate, the cycle continued. The ceremonies themselves were often elaborate, blending pageantry with culinary craft. During festivals, the streets filled with music, chanting, and the unmistakable aroma of things roasting. Things you sometimes wished you hadn't identified. Entire communities would gather to watch ritual dances, observe sacrifices, and then line up for the communal meal. Depending on the god in question, the feast might include beans, tamales, squash, dog meat, or, on particularly intense occasions, the cooked limbs of someone recently honoured on the altar. Not every religious meal included human ingredients, but even the vegetarian dishes were steeped in symbolism. Certain gods preferred specific foods, and deviating from the menu was not advised. Tlaloc, the rain god, liked frogs and aquatic plants, fitting if a bit slimy. Totec, the flayed god of agriculture, was celebrated with offerings of maize and sometimes the skin of a sacrificed victim, worn by priests like a sacred, slightly drippy shawl. One can only imagine the food safety violations. It's important to note that these rituals weren't barbaric chaos. They were formal, organised, and deeply meaningful. To the Aztecs, this was the only way to keep the universe from collapsing. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and now it was humanity's turn to return the favour, preferably on a rotating schedule with side dishes. The ceremonies reinforced social structure, maintained cosmic order, and reminded everyone to be very, very grateful they weren't selected this year. For commoners, participation often meant offering a portion of their food. The first tortilla, the ripest chili, a cup of pulque, as a gesture of thanks. These daily offerings were modest, but consistent. It was a way of showing the gods you remembered your place, and more importantly, that you were willing to share your lunch. Because in a world where a poor harvest could mean the gods were angry, superstition and survival were on the same plate. Through it all, the Aztecs maintained an unshakable conviction that food was a form of language, one that spoke to the divine. Every ingredient had meaning. Every recipe had purpose. Even the strangest combinations, like maize stuffed with blood-soaked feathers or a stew simmered with bone fragments, weren't just culinary oddities. They were prayers, written in steam and spice. So the next time you light a scented candle or whisper a wish over birthday cake, remember, the Aztecs did it first. Only their version involved more screaming and significantly less frosting. In the great ceremonial calendar of the Aztec Empire, there were certain meals that no one looked forward to, except perhaps the gods. These weren't casual dinners or communal potlucks. They were ritual feasts, timed with celestial precision and cooked with a disturbing blend of reverence and creativity. The recipes varied, the seasonings changed, but one thing remained constant. Someone, somewhere, wasn't going to survive the appetizer course. Sacrifice wasn't a grim necessity to the Aztecs. It was a sacred obligation, a kind of divine debt payment with high-interest blood. And while not every ceremony ended with a dismembered body on the altar, many did. The lucky few who were chosen, or captured, were honoured in ways that, at first glance, might have looked like kindness. They were fed well, dressed in fine clothes, treated with ceremonial respect. It was a bit like being crowned prom king, if prom ended with you being flayed and handed out in chunks to the upper class. Among the many rituals that blurred the line between religion and culinary experiment, none was quite so infamous as the preparation of post-sacrificial stew. It sounds metaphorical. It wasn't. After a ceremonial sacrifice, usually the removal of the heart on a temple platform, often while thousands watched, the remaining body wasn't always discarded. In select festivals, the limbs of the honoured victim were taken down, cleaned, and prepared for what scholars politely refer to as ritual consumption. Less politely, it was dinner. Now, before anyone imagines a population of bloodthirsty cannibals gnawing on ribs every weekend, it's important to note that this was highly regulated and not done casually. The act of consuming human flesh was ceremonial, not dietary. Only specific individuals, usually nobles, priests, or high-status warriors, were allowed to partake. The meat was sometimes stewed with maize and chilies, served in a thick broth alongside amaranth and squash. It was not a snack. It was an offering made edible, a gesture of cosmic respect, and possibly the world's most uncomfortable potluck. The dish was known in some sources as tlacatlaoli, literally man stew. It was believed to contain the spiritual essence of the sacrificed individual, who had become a living vessel of the divine. Eating part of this person was not seen as grotesque. It was seen as communion with the gods, a direct line to their favour. Of course, it was also seen as a status symbol. Not everyone got a bowl. For many commoners, it was something they only heard about, like a royal feast, except with significantly more implications. The preparation of the body followed careful rules. Flesh from the thighs and upper arms was preferred. Organs, being messy and symbolic in other ways, were usually reserved for direct offering, not the dinner table. The bones were cleaned and often retained as sacred relics. In some cases, the skin was worn by priests during post-sacrificial ceremonies, not during the cooking, one hopes. And all of it was wrapped in layers of ritual, myth, and chili pepper. The guests at such a feast were not giddy or ravenous. They were solemn, respectful, and perhaps a little tense. This wasn't a backyard barbecue. It was a sacred reenactment of divine cycles. To consume the flesh was to take on a fragment of divine essence. The act bound the participants to the gods, to the state, and to the unsettling reality that they could just as easily be on the menu next year. A deeply spiritual experience, yes, but not exactly appetizing. Not all sacrificial meals involved human flesh, of course. More commonly, offerings to the gods were symbolic foods, maize dough shaped like humans, effigies made of amaranth and honey, cakes adorned with flowers and sacred herbs. These were paraded, blessed, sacrificed through ritual gestures, and then distributed to the people. It was a way of sharing the divine bounty without involving a coroner. Still, the resemblance to actual bodies was often uncanny. One festival featured dough figures with real fingernails pressed into the arms. Symbolic, certainly. Comforting, less so. There were also meals designed as rehearsals for sacrifice. In some rituals, a young man impersonating a god would be treated as divine for a full year, given fine clothes, taught sacred songs, and fed carefully curated meals. On the final day, he was paraded through the streets, allowed to bid farewell to the city, and then sacrificed. His body was sometimes eaten, but more often, his death was symbolic enough. The meal was the year-long preparation, the slow cooking of identity, devotion, and doom. To outsiders, particularly the Spanish, these practices were horrifying. When conquistadors arrived, they recoiled at the idea of post-sacrificial meals and sacred stews. They documented the rituals with a mixture of disgust and fascination, often exaggerating details for effect, but even their horrified accounts couldn't erase the logic that underpinned these traditions. To the Aztecs, the world ran on cycles of life and death, of giving and receiving. The gods had fed humanity through their own sacrifice. Now it was humanity's turn to offer something back, preferably seasoned. So the next time you pass a bowl of stew without asking what's in it, take a moment to reflect. Somewhere, in the shadow of the Templo Mayor, a similar question was asked, followed by a polite nod, a ceremonial spoon, and the quiet understanding that sometimes dinner comes with obligations. Cannibalism is one of those words that tends to short-circuit rational thought. It summons tabloid images and horror movie soundtracks, conjuring up visions of wild-eyed tribesmen gnawing on femurs in the jungle, or desperate survivors snowed in on a mountainside. So when people hear the word Aztec, followed closely by cannibalism, the reaction is usually a mix of fascination and revulsion, followed by a quick mental image of something best not described before bedtime. But like most things in history, the reality was more complicated and significantly more organized. To the Aztecs, cannibalism wasn't monstrous. It was meaningful. It wasn't a constant, daily practice. It was rare, sacred, and strictly ceremonial, a highly regulated act of religious devotion reserved for specific people at specific times. It wasn't about hunger. It was about hierarchy, divinity, and ritual. If someone was eating human flesh in Tenochtitlan, they weren't a wild-eyed lunatic hiding in an alley. They were probably a high-ranking priest or noble, sitting in ceremonial robes and chewing thoughtfully on a slice of thigh while contemplating cosmic balance. The practice centered around human sacrifice, which to the Aztecs wasn't just a spectacle or a punishment. It was a repayment. The gods, according to myth, had sacrificed themselves to create the world. The sun moved because it was fed. The rain fell because it was honored. And what the gods wanted, more than anything, was life energy. Warm, red, and freshly removed. Hearts were the most valuable currency. But sometimes, the rest of the body was part of the transaction too. And in those cases, the meat didn't go to waste. This wasn't some post-apocalyptic free-for-all, where anyone could line up with a fork. The privilege of partaking in post-sacrificial flesh was tightly controlled. Only the upper classes, priests, warriors, rulers, were allowed to participate. And even then, it was done sparingly and with layers of ritual. The flesh was prepared carefully, often cooked in stews with chilies and maize. It wasn't served raw or roasted on a spit like a pig at a luau. The preparation reflected the sacredness of the act. It wasn't indulgence, it was communion. The individuals consumed were typically captured warriors, taken during the infamous Flower Wars, ritual battles fought less for conquest and more for sacrificial stock. These captives were treated with a strange blend of respect and inevitability. They were often allowed to live for weeks or months before their sacrifice, fed well, dressed finely, and even trained to perform ceremonial roles. On the appointed day, they were led to the top of the pyramid, honoured and offered to the gods. Their hearts were removed, their bodies sometimes distributed, and their status as sacred offerings was never in doubt. The most common dish associated with this practice was something later chroniclers described as tlacatlaoli, a stew made with maize and meat. In this case, human meat. Thighs and upper arms were preferred, as they were the most muscular and symbolically powerful. Internal organs were usually left out, either offered separately to the gods or disposed of in other ritual ways. Bones were often preserved, polished, or used to make ceremonial tools and ornaments. And skulls, of course, went on display, the infamous zompantli, or skull racks, being equal parts art installation and religious accounting system. It's important to pause here and acknowledge something. This wasn't unique. Across history and across cultures, ritual cannibalism has appeared repeatedly. In ancient Fiji, it was a mark of revenge. Among certain tribes in Papua New Guinea, it was believed to transfer strength or wisdom. In ancient China, stories tell of filial cannibalism, offering one's flesh to sick parents as a final act of devotion. And then there's the modern West, where symbolic cannibalism appears every Sunday, in churches as congregants consume bread and wine in the body and blood of Christ. Context, as always, is everything. What sets the Aztecs apart isn't just that they did it, it's how carefully they did it. The act was sacred, ceremonial, and framed by a worldview where death wasn't an end, but a continuation. The sacrifice renewed the cycle. The eating acknowledged the power of the gods. It was a transfer of energy, a physical expression of gratitude, and a blunt reminder that no one was too important to end up on someone else's plate if the gods willed it. Of course, the Spanish didn't see it that way. To the conquistadors, steeped in Catholic doctrine and raised on pork fat, the idea of eating human flesh, even symbolically, was the height of depravity. They were appalled, outraged, and conveniently armed. When they wrote their reports, they leaned hard into the cannibalism angle, using it as moral justification for conquest. "Look at these savages," they essentially said, "eating people like animals." What they left out was the part where their own society burned people alive in public squares for disagreeing with church doctrine. Perspective. Modern historians remain divided on the scale of Aztec cannibalism. The written records, mostly from Spanish sources, are often sensationalized. Archaeological evidence is harder to interpret. Scattered bones, cut marks, and cooking tools suggest it did happen, but not frequently, and not everywhere. It seems to have been limited to major cities, religious centres, and high ceremonies. It was never routine. It was never thoughtless. It was always part of something bigger. And no, they weren't eating people out of starvation. The protein argument, the idea that the Aztecs resorted to cannibalism because they lacked domesticated livestock, has been largely debunked. The empire had access to a wide variety of protein sources: fish, insects, amphibians, turkeys, ducks, dogs, and more. They were incredibly resourceful, and their diet was nutritionally rich by pre-modern standards. Cannibalism wasn't about filling a gap in the food chain. It was about filling a gap in the soul, or, more precisely, the sun. It's also worth noting that the Aztecs weren't particularly squeamish. They lived in a world where blood was normal, death was close, and the line between human and divine was blurry. If a priest needed to wear the flayed skin of a sacrificial victim to complete a ritual, he wore it. No gloves, no apology. If a nobleman was offered a small bowl of divine stew, he accepted it with reverence. This was a culture that embraced mortality not as tragedy, but as currency, and for a select few, their flesh became part of the transaction. In the end, Aztec cannibalism is less about appetite and more about theology. It was a way of connecting with the gods, honouring the sacrificed, and reinforcing a worldview where everything, even the body, could be sacred if properly prepared. It may sound horrifying now, from the safe distance of modern sensibilities and fully stocked supermarkets, but to them, it made perfect sense. The gods gave life. The people returned it, sometimes with spices. Before we continue marinating in blood rituals and ceremonial stews, let's pause to appreciate the most important, least dramatic ingredient in the entire Aztec Empire: maize, corn, that golden, nubbled, deceptively boring kernel that somehow managed to feed millions, fuel an empire, and earn divine status, all without tasting like much of anything on its own. In the Aztec world, maize wasn't just a crop. It was a way of life, a god, a metaphor. And the answer to the question, how do we keep this entire civilization running on the culinary equivalent of damp paper? Maize was everywhere. It was in every home, every market, every stomach. You could boil it, grind it, mash it, wrap it, ferment it, dry it, rehydrate it, or shape it into something that looked vaguely human and then offer it to a deity. You could make tamales, tortillas, atole, a kind of corn porridge, or tlacatlaoli, which we've already discussed and will not revisit before dinner. The point is, if there was a food problem, maize was the solution. It didn't need to be interesting. It just needed to be present. And it was, always. But before it could be eaten, maize needed help. Raw corn isn't just bland, it's stubborn. The Aztecs used a process called nixtamalization, which sounds like a spell but is actually a brilliant early food science technique. Kernels were soaked and cooked in an alkaline solution, usually lime water, which did several magical things. It made the maize easier to grind, boosted its nutritional value, and made the resulting dough, masa, much more usable. Without this process, the Aztec diet would have been nutritionally hollow and structurally disappointing. With it, they got soft tortillas, strong bones, and one less reason to die before age 30. The mythology around maize was no less elaborate. According to Aztec creation stories, humans were made from maize. The gods had tried other ingredients, clay, wood, even animals, but none of them stuck. It wasn't until they found the right kind of maize, hidden deep in the underworld, that they were able to craft people who were sturdy, obedient, and full of potential. In other words, they invented humanity with a tortilla press. This made every bite of corn a miniature act of remembrance. You were consuming your origins. You were quite literally eating what you were. Maize even had its own gods. Chief among them was Sentiotl, the maize deity, often depicted as a youthful figure, sprouting vegetation from his head, which one assumes made wearing hats difficult. He was the god of sustenance, agriculture, and the seasonal cycles of planting and harvest. Festivals were held in his honour, complete with ritual offerings, song, and of course, maize-based snacks. You didn't worship Kentiotl by burning incense alone. You ground the corn, steamed the tamales, and made sure the dough figures had eyes and a smile. Then you ate them, respectfully. For commoners, maize was the backbone of every meal. Breakfast? Probably a tole, a hot watery corn drink with a few spices. Lunch? Tortillas filled with beans? Maybe a bit of chili if you were lucky. Dinner? More tortillas, maybe torn into a broth to stretch whatever scraps of greens or bugs you could find. It wasn't exciting, but it worked. And that's the thing about maize. It was boring on purpose, because boring meant reliable, and reliable meant survival. That's not to say it couldn't be dressed up. The Aztecs were skilled cooks, even if they didn't have butter, cheese, or any of the things that usually make corn more than an edible napkin. They added chilies, herbs, tomatoes, and squash. They wrapped the dough around meat, fish, or the occasional iguana tail. They layered it, fried it, steamed it, or left it to dry in the sun. And because the average Aztec ate something like 70% of their calories in the form of maize, variety wasn't just a luxury, it was a public service. The elite, of course, had access to the better versions. White maize, softer, finer, and less gritty, was reserved for the upper class. Their tortillas were delicate, warm, and served in neat little stacks alongside tender meats and rare fruits. The poor got yellow or red maize, often coarsely ground and cooked into tough cakes that could double as sandals in a pinch. Social class didn't just affect what you ate, it determined the texture of your corn. Still, despite the monotony, maize held a strange power. It unified the empire. It was grown in every region, traded across vast distances, and woven into every festival and offering. Tribute paid to the emperor often included sacks of maize. Temples had storerooms devoted to it. Entire professions existed solely to cultivate, grind, and cook it. If maize had vanished, the empire would have collapsed in less than a week, or at least grown very cranky. Even today, maize is everywhere in Mexico. Modern tortillas trace a direct line to their Aztec ancestors, albeit with more refrigeration and fewer ritual implications. Tamales remain a comfort food. A tole is still drunk in the mornings. And while no one's carving effigies out of cornmeal to offer to sun gods these days, probably the cultural reverence remains. Corn isn't just food, it's history, it's identity, it's edible legacy. So yes, maize was bland, it was humble, it had the texture of paste and the flavour of slightly warmed beige, but it also fed an empire, underpinned a religion, and kept millions alive long enough to develop poetry, science, architecture, and ritual calendars with more precision than most modern dentists. That's more than can be said for a slice of white bread. And unlike the more dramatic dishes we've encountered, human stew included, maize never needed an explanation. It just worked. Not every Aztec meal was a ritual, and not every dish came with a side of human sacrifice. Most of the time, food was just food, a practical daily affair that had to feed millions of people across cities, villages, and floating farms. But even at its most ordinary, Aztec cuisine rarely felt ordinary by modern standards. If you were walking through the markets of Tenochtitlan in search of lunch, odds were good that you'd come across something roasted, something wriggling, and something staring at you with its last expression still intact. Let's begin with the staples, tortillas and tamales. These were the blank canvases of the Aztec diet, ever present and endlessly adaptable. Tortillas were made from masa, flattened into rounds and cooked on a hot griddle, simple, durable and edible, even after being left in a pouch for most of the day. Tamales were more of a production, steamed corn dough wrapped in leaves, filled with whatever ingredients were on hand. Beans, chilies and squash were common. Meat, if you had it, elevated the meal from subsistence to celebration. Of course, meat could mean turkey, dog, iguana, or something unidentifiable and vaguely stringy. Street food in the Aztec world wasn't sold from carts or sizzling on flat-top grills. It was hawked from mats on the ground, prepared fresh by vendors who had likely been up since before sunrise, grinding maize and slicing chilies. You could buy tamales stuffed with frog legs, grasshoppers toasted until they crackled, or tortillas folded over mashed beans and dusted with dried ant larvae. That last one, escamoles, was considered a delicacy, nutty, rich and expensive. And like many delicacies across time, it came with a texture most people would rather not discuss. Salsa was available in abundance, and it was not subtle. Aztec chilies came in all shapes and fire levels, from sharp green jolts to smoky, slow-burning reds. These were blended with tomatoes, herbs, and sometimes fermented insects to create sauces that could enhance any meal or obliterate it entirely. If you thought your tamale was bland, one spoonful of chili and maguey worm salsa would correct your attitude. Whether or not it would spare your digestive system was another matter. Then there were the truly creative protein sources, not strange by Aztec standards, but certainly eyebrow-raising today. Lizards, snakes, salamanders, and small rodents were often caught and grilled whole. Nothing was wasted. Heads, tails, claws, all of it could be served. Fish were eaten fresh or dried, usually whole, with bones left in and eyes unremoved. Crayfish and axolotls, plucked from the lakes and canals, were sometimes stewed or roasted until their gelatinous bodies crisped up, just enough to qualify as food, and not a practical joke. Insects filled a major nutritional gap and were available in seasonal waves. Grasshoppers were roasted and seasoned like snack food. Maguey worms were either fried or stuffed into tacos. Water bugs, large hard-shelled creatures from the lakes, were sometimes ground into pastes or eaten whole. Fly eggs, harvested from lake reeds, were gathered in clumps and dried into something resembling caviar, if caviar were grainy, beige, and sourced from a swamp. And yes, people ate it with pride. Nutritionally, these were all excellent choices. Texturally, they were often a dare. Aztec home cooking was, unsurprisingly, less extravagant than what you'd find in the markets. Most meals were boiled or stewed in clay pots over small fires. The result was usually a kind of porridge, maize, beans and vegetables, cooked together until it all resembled beige paste. To that, you might add some chili, a pinch of herbs or, if it was a special day, a scrap of meat or a handful of insects. This was food designed for efficiency. One bowl, eaten slowly, with a consistency of wet cement and roughly the same visual appeal. Fermented drinks were sometimes included, especially at festivals. Pulque, made from the fermented sap of the maguey plant, was mildly alcoholic and slightly viscous. Imagine if kombucha had a cousin who lived in a swamp. It was drunk by farmers, priests and nobles alike, though public intoxication wasn't encouraged unless it was part of a sanctioned religious event. Children were usually given a tole, a thin maize drink flavoured with chili or honey, depending on the occasion. Milk didn't exist, dairy wasn't a thing, and no one missed it. What's striking about all this is how little went to waste. The Aztecs ate what their environment gave them, not out of desperation, but out of practicality and respect. Every lake, field, and tree was a source of food. They didn't draw lines between the palatable and the grotesque the way modern societies do. If it had protein, it had potential. That doesn't mean everything tasted good. Plenty of it didn't. But it kept people alive, fueled labour, and maintained a culture where food was deeply connected to identity, season, and survival. For all the bizarre ingredients, there was a remarkable elegance to the system. Food was local, seasonal, and deeply tied to place. Every region had its own specialties. Coastal villages focused on seafood and salt. Highland communities grew different varieties of maize and squash. The empire's size meant that ingredients could be traded across hundreds of miles, and recipes evolved to match what was available. There was no such thing as a national dish, because the whole nation was the dish. Of course, sometimes you didn't ask what you were eating. If a stew was spicy enough, if the tortillas were warm enough, if the salsa brought tears to your eyes, the details didn't always matter. A tail here, a claw there, something chewy in the middle that might have once blinked. Food was food, and if it filled your stomach and didn't kill you, it was doing its job. The Aztecs weren't squeamish. They were pragmatic. And in the end, that pragmatism built an empire. One tamale, one anteg, and one chili-drenched taco at a time. In the Aztec world, insects weren't pests, they were proteins. And not just in the we'll eat these if we have to kind of way. They were a respected, deliberate part of the diet. Grasshoppers, worms, ants, larvae, eggs. Each one had a place on the plate, and sometimes in the marketplace, the stew pot, all ground up and stirred into salsa that could set your face on fire. For the Aztecs, insects weren't an afterthought. They were a food group. Nutritionally, insects were something of a superfood, rich in protein, easy to harvest, and disturbingly prolific. They required no grazing pastures, no long-term storage, and no elaborate tools to catch. Just a pair of hands, some patience, and in many cases a quick roast over the fire to transform something that once wriggled into something that now crunched. The Aztecs knew what modern science is slowly relearning. Bugs are efficient, sustainable, and surprisingly filling, if you don't think too hard about where the legs went. Grasshoppers or chapulines were the crowd favourite. Found in meadows and farmland, they were often collected in massive quantities during the dry season, when they were most abundant. Vendors would toast them on clay griddles, season them with salt, chili and lime, and sell them in heaping piles. They were portable, affordable, and came pre-packaged by nature in a crunchy little shell. People ate them by the handful, like popcorn, or stuffed them into tortillas for a makeshift taco that stared back at you with unblinking insect indifference. Then there were the maguey worms, thick white larvae that lived in the core of the maguey plant, the same plant used to make pulque. These worms were considered a delicacy, in part because they weren't always easy to find. You had to cut open the plant, extract the writhing tenants, and then cook them quickly before they escaped. Roasted maguey worms were buttery, fatty, and rich in flavour, like a cross between pork crackling and existential discomfort. They were often saved for special meals or given as gifts. Nothing says "I respect you" quite like a carefully toasted larva. Fly eggs also made the list, particularly those harvested from aquatic reeds around Lake Texcoco. Known as ahuatl, these tiny, glistening eggs were gathered by skimming the water's edge, collecting the clumps, drying them in the sun, and either grinding them into meal or cooking them whole. The result was a dish that resembled caviar if you squinted and lied to yourself. Salty, grainy, and faintly fishy, It was a popular topping for tamales and tortillas, a reminder that lakes can provide far more than fish, and sometimes far more than you ever wanted. Ants were also on the menu, specifically the Eskimos, or ant larvae, harvested from the roots of agave plants. These pearly white morsels were labour-intensive to gather, but prized for their creamy texture and nutty flavour. Once cooked, they looked vaguely like grains of rice, and tasted far better than their origin might suggest. High in protein and calcium, Eskimos were the kind of dish that showed up at important meals and religious festivals, carefully prepared and even more carefully portioned, not because they were rare, but because they were expensive. You weren't likely to find ant eggs in a poor farmer's stew pot unless he had very persistent ants. Some insects weren't just food, but seasoning. Tiny beetles could be ground into powders to add colour or bitterness. Winged termites were sometimes toasted and mixed with spices to make dipping powders. Water bugs, collected from lakes and marshes, could be used to flavour broths, added whole to certain dishes, or just eaten as is by people who had long since given up on being surprised by what their food looked like before it was cooked. Texture was less a barrier than a feature. Insects weren't treated as low-class food. They had economic and ceremonial value. Many were traded in the markets alongside beans, chilies, and maize. Some had roles in seasonal festivals. Others were associated with specific gods or used as offerings. The gathering of insects was a community effort, with families and neighbours working together to collect and process them. Children helped gather grasshoppers. Women roasted and seasoned the catches. Men might go out into the reeds for eggs or dive into lakes for bugs clinging to the shoreline. It was a system, unpleasant maybe, but efficient. If all of this sounds horrifying to the modern palate, it's worth remembering that every culture has its edible oddities. Europeans have blue cheese, milk deliberately rotted with mould. The Chinese have century eggs, preserved in a process that makes them taste like sulfur and sadness. Americans put marshmallows on sweet potatoes and call it tradition. The Aztecs simply did what worked. Their insects were sustainable, local, packed with nutrients, and easy to prepare. They didn't care about optics. They cared about getting through the day without starving. And in many ways, the insect-based diet was ahead of its time. It didn't require deforestation. It didn't need huge plots of land or herds of methane-producing animals. It could be maintained year-round and adapted to seasonal shifts. The insects bred themselves, required no formal training, and offered a reliable protein source that could feed both cities and rural communities. Today, with environmental concerns growing and traditional meat production under scrutiny, scientists and entrepreneurs are starting to revisit the same wriggling ideas the Aztecs relied on centuries ago. So while the thought of biting into a taco filled with fried larvae or scooping ant eggs onto a steaming tamale might send a modern eater running for the exit, the Aztecs wouldn't have flinched. They would have smiled, offered you a freshly roasted grasshopper with a touch of chili, and told you, politely, of course, to stop being so dramatic. After all, in a world without cows or chickens, sometimes dinner buzzed before it crunched. At first glance, the Chinampas of the Aztec Empire seemed like something out of a utopia. Stretching across the shallow, murky lakes around Tenochtitlan were long, narrow rectangles of lush green, floating gardens that made the watery landscape look like a checkerboard of life. Birds flew overhead, frogs croaked rhythmically from the canals, and vegetables sprouted in orderly rows with such enthusiasm you'd think they were being paid. It was a marvel of pre-modern agriculture, engineered without metal tools, wheels, or beasts of burden, and for a moment it all looked beautiful, until you got closer to the water. The lakes of central Mexico were not pristine mountain springs. They were swampy, cloudy, and thick with the runoff of a city that sacrificed thousands and composted with extreme enthusiasm. The The water around the Chinampas contained fertile nutrients, yes, but also algae blooms, decomposing plant matter, and, on occasion, the sort of refuse that should never be touched without gloves and a strong stomach. There were fish, of course, and useful plants like water lilies and reeds, but there were also leeches, biting insects, and the occasional piece of someone who had, until recently, been a ceremonial offering. Nature, in its rawest form, was doing its best to fertilise the empire. Despite the murky conditions, Chinampas were remarkably effective. The system worked like this. Farmers created small artificial islands by piling mud, lake sediment, and decomposing vegetation into rectangular plots, which were anchored in place with stakes and fast-growing willow trees. These islands were separated by canals, which allowed for easy irrigation, transportation, and the occasional splash of swamp ambience. The soil, continually replenished by nutrient-rich muck dredged from the lake bottom, was astonishingly productive. Crops grew faster, healthier, and more abundantly than in traditional dryland fields. The system was so efficient it could support multiple harvests per year, all without fertilizers or pesticides, just rotting matter and ingenuity. What the Aztecs grew on these floating plots was nothing short of impressive. Corn, of course, was everywhere. It always was, but Chinampas were especially good for vegetables and herbs. Squash, tomatoes, chili peppers, beans, and amaranth thrived in the moist soil. Medicinal plants like sage and epizoti were cultivated alongside flowering herbs used in rituals and cooking. Every available inch was planted with something useful. The result was a kind of aquatic Eden, managed with careful precision and unrelenting manual labour. It wasn't glamorous, but it fed the empire, flavoured the food, and kept the priests in flower crowns during festivals. The canals between Chinampas doubled as transport routes. Farmers paddled canoes loaded with vegetables, flowers, and baskets of herbs into the markets of Tenochtitlan. Early mornings saw the lakes ripple with traffic, the air filled with the scent of crushed basil and damp earth, and the occasional splash of something falling into the water, sometimes a fish, sometimes a sandal, and sometimes a crate of particularly squirmy cargo. Despite the logistical complexity, the system worked like a charm. Produce arrived fresh, markets stayed full, and the city kept eating. All thanks to an ecosystem balanced precariously on mud, sticks, and optimism. Of course, it wasn't all serene paddling and dewy cucumbers. Maintaining Chinampas was backbreaking work. The mud had to be dredged regularly, the willows trimmed, the water flow managed with a kind of intuitive hydrology that modern civil engineers would envy. Farmers rose before dawn, navigated cold, misty canals, and spent their days ankle-deep in wet earth, fighting off mosquitoes and hoping they didn't accidentally step on something with too many legs. The line between farmer and swamp creature blurred quickly. There were also the less charming realities of lake-based agriculture. The water might have been fertile, but it wasn't always clean. Human waste, sacrificial remains, and whatever else flowed from the temples upstream made its way into the lakes. This was not an era known for its sanitation standards, and while the Aztecs had some remarkable public hygiene systems, including aqueducts and public baths, it didn't stop the occasional leech from finding its way into a farmer's sandal or a ceremonial bone from bumping into a canoe. You learned to ignore the floaters, or at least pretend you didn't see them. Yet for all the swampy grime, the Chinampas were revered. They represented the pinnacle of Aztec agricultural engineering, proof that the empire could bend nature to its will, even in the most inhospitable places. They made land where none existed, turned water into food, and transformed marshes into markets. The floating gardens fed the capital, sustained the festivals, and allowed the priests to issue long-winded prayers over bowls of soup that wouldn't exist without a guy ankle-deep in lake muck on the other side of town. Civilization, in all its ritual and glory, was built on rotting algae and duckweed. Even enemies of the Aztecs marvelled at the system. Spanish chroniclers described the Chinampas with grudging admiration, noting their productivity and elegance, usually before segueing into a rant about idolatry and cannibalism. The gardens were unlike anything they'd seen in Europe. The idea that fertile farmland could float, that food could be grown on artificial islands in the middle of a lake, was both baffling and irritating to people who still relied on ploughing fields with oxen and hoping the weather cooperated. In the end, Chinampas were a triumph of adaptation. The Aztecs didn't conquer their landscape so much as they rearranged it. They used mud, sticks, and time-tested knowledge to create a system that was self-renewing, low-waste, and remarkably effective. Today, fragments of the Chinampa system still exist near Xochimilco, though now they're more likely to be used for tourist boats and mariachi performances than squash farming. But the spirit of the system remains, a quiet reminder that once a civilization figured out how to feed an empire using nothing but swamp water, floating gardens, and the sheer force of human stubbornness. The lakes of the Aztec Valley were more than scenery. They were pantries. Lake Texcoco and its surrounding waterways may have looked murky and mosquito-infested from the shoreline, but beneath the surface was a writhing buffet of edible life. Fish, frogs, salamanders, shrimp-like crustaceans, and a strange little creature with a permanent smile and frilly gills, the famous axolotl. If it swam, crawled, or squelched through the water, it was fair game. Aztec cuisine didn't discriminate, it adapted. Fishing wasn't a matter of sailing into deep waters with nets and hope. These were shallow lakes, brackish, often stagnant, sometimes salty, always unpredictable. The Aztecs used canoes and small nets, sometimes even bare hands, to gather what they could. Men waded into waist-high water with baskets, scooping up whatever darted between reeds or squirmed out of the mud. The catch might be small, but it was steady, and over time, these aquatic creatures became a cornerstone of the empire's protein intake, whether they looked edible or not. One of the most bizarre and beloved creatures to emerge from this watery ecosystem was the axolotl. Technically a salamander, it defied all biological expectations. It didn't undergo metamorphosis like normal amphibians. It stayed in its juvenile form forever, floating around with a goofy expression and external gills that looked like aquatic pom-poms. It was so unique that even modern biologists treat it like nature's oddball experiment. To the Aztecs, it was less of a scientific curiosity and more of a slow-moving snack. Axolotls were caught in the canals, roasted whole, and served as a delicacy, soft on the inside, crispy on the outside, and unsettlingly intact. But axolotls weren't the only creatures dragged from the lakes. There were also tiny fish, often dried in the sun, and used to flavour soups and stews. They were rarely filleted or cleaned, just scaled, salted, and eaten whole. Heads, tails, bones, eyeballs, everything went in, especially if it had spent the day crisping in the sun on a reed mat. These fish were small, bony, and incredibly salty, which made them ideal for preservation and ideal for making sure no child ever forgot to chew. Frogs and tadpoles were also popular. The frogs were grilled or stewed, sometimes stuffed with herbs or maize mash if someone was feeling fancy. Tadpoles, on the other hand, were more of a seasonal treat. They could be dried and eaten like chips or ground into paste and used in sauces. Texture varied between slimy and gelatinous regret, but nutritionally, they were a sound choice. Amphibians were abundant, easy to catch and impossible to mistake for anything else. A bonus when you were fishing in a lake that occasionally doubled as a sacrificial runoff. Crayfish-like creatures, sometimes described as freshwater shrimp or small lobsters, were also collected. These were boiled, smashed or roasted, depending on size and mood. Some were ground into seasoning pastes to flavour stews. Others were served as the main event, shells and all, cracked open with fingers and teeth. They may not have had the grandeur of an ocean lobster, but they were easier to find and didn't require a sea voyage, just a lake, a net, and a willingness to get wet. Then there were algae and lake scum, which sounds like something scraped off a boat hull, but which the Aztecs turned into a dietary staple. Spirulina, a type of blue-green algae, was collected from the surface of the lake, dried into flat cakes, and eaten as a source of protein and nutrients. These cakes, called tequitlatl, were green, vaguely fishy, and looked like someone had tried to press seaweed into currency. Still, they were nutritious, filling, and widely available. They could be crumbled into stews, folded into tortillas, or eaten on their own if you were feeling brave or particularly hungry. What's notable is how little went to waste. The Aztecs didn't clean their catch the way modern chefs might. Fish were rarely deboned. Amphibians were cooked whole. Even the smallest creatures were thrown into the pot without much modification. The assumption was that you'd either chew carefully or just get used to the crunch. It wasn't about presentation. It was about utility. And in a society where most people didn't have ovens, refrigerators, or the luxury of being picky, this made sense. Of course, eating food with eyes still attached isn't for everyone. Even today, whole fish are controversial. The Aztecs, however, didn't seem fazed by it. A fish that looked back was simply proof that it was fresh. A salamander with gills was just one more form of meat. They ate what they caught, and what they caught was the lake, living, squirming, and fully flavoured. Religion, unsurprisingly, wasn't far from the menu. Certain aquatic creatures were associated with gods and rituals. Offerings were made with lake food, and some species were considered especially sacred during festivals. Others were simply seasonal. Flooding patterns changed the available fish and insects, and diets adjusted accordingly. The lake fed the people, and the people fed the gods who, in turn, were expected to keep the water flowing and the axolotls plump. In the end, Lake Texcoco was more than a body of water. It was a sprawling, semi-edible ecosystem, teeming with everything from nutritious muck to gourmet amphibians. It provided the empire with food, fertilizer, transport, and the occasional surprise when something unexpected floated by. It wasn't always clean, it wasn't always pleasant, but it was constant. And for the Aztecs, that was enough. They turned murky water into nourishment, slimy creatures into sustenance, and an entire lake into lunch, one blinking, slightly damp bite at a time. In the modern world, chocolate is synonymous with sweetness, comfort, and indulgence. It's a love language, a holiday staple, and a quick fix for emotional crises. But the Aztecs would not have recognized the chocolate bar, or the truffle, or the caramel-stuffed cocoa bomb in your Instagram feed. To them, cacao was sacred, bitter, and borderline violent, not a dessert, but a stimulant, a form of currency, and a thick, gritty drink that walked the line between religious rite and controlled substance. Cacao beans were valuable, and not in a casual way. They were literal money. You could pay taxes in cacao. You could tip your local priest with cacao. You could buy a good turkey for a few hundred beans, and a prostitute for a few dozen, assuming she charged market rate. Cacao was standardized, portable, and occasionally counterfeited by unscrupulous vendors who stuffed empty shells with dirt. A handful of beans jingling in a pouch was the Aztec equivalent of pocket change, except you could technically drink it if the economy collapsed. Despite its value as currency, cacao's most important role was in the cup, specifically as xocolatl, the Aztec chocolate drink. But anyone imagining something warm, creamy, and gently sweet is about to be deeply disappointed. This wasn't comfort food. It was a frothy, bitter, cold liquid made by grinding roasted cacao beans into a paste, mixing it with water, and adding chili, maize flour, or ground flours depending on the recipe. No sugar, no milk, Just spicy, gritty, slightly oily, sacred mud that had to be beaten into a froth using a wooden whisk or poured back and forth between containers until it developed an acceptable foam. And foam was everything. To the Aztecs, the froth wasn't just aesthetic, it was spiritual. The bubbles were thought to carry the breath of the gods, and a well-frothed cup was a sign of proper respect and technique. It also masked some of the more challenging textures involved. Early sources described the drink as thick, often grainy, and sometimes physically exhausting to consume. You didn't sip it for pleasure. You drank it for power, and possibly to survive whatever spiritual, political, or digestive trials lay ahead. Cacao was associated with prestige and ritual. Commoners didn't drink it regularly, if at all. It was reserved for warriors, nobles, priests, and rulers. It was consumed before battles, after ceremonies, during banquets, and in private by those who needed a clear head and a burst of energy. The caffeine and theobromine content in cacao provided a noticeable lift, somewhere between coffee and pre-workout powder, with a side of intestinal uncertainty. The chili didn't help with comfort, but it made sure you paid attention. In the temples, cacao was used as an offering to the gods, sometimes poured out onto altars, sometimes consumed in ritual. There are accounts of cacao being mixed with blood, either human or animal, to heighten its sacred potency. This was not your average beverage. This was a drink that could accompany sacrifices, anoint idols, or serve as the prelude to decisions involving war, diplomacy, or ceremonial flaying. And while some of the more extravagant recipes may have included things like ground vanilla pods or wildflowers, the baseline remained the same: dark, bitter, and spiritually loaded. It's possible that, in larger quantities or under the right conditions, this drink could produce mild hallucinations, particularly if combined with fasting, prayer, or whatever the priest added without telling you. Some mixtures included fermented maize or psychoactive plants. Others were simply so potent and spicy that they created the illusion of enlightenment through pain. At minimum, it left you wide-eyed, alert and questioning your life choices, which for a religious experience was probably the goal. Cacao's social significance extended into the world of courtship and status. Giving someone a cup of cacao could be romantic or diplomatic, depending on the context. It could seal a marriage arrangement, finalize a treaty, or simply imply, "I see you as a person of worth and froth." To reject a cacao offering was rude. To spill one was disastrous. And to serve it weak, unfrothed or lukewarm was essentially an act of culinary heresy. There were rules. Chocolate was serious business. It's worth emphasizing how jarring this version of chocolate would be to modern taste buds. Without sugar, the natural bitterness of cacao dominates. Without milk, the texture is oily and dense. Add in the chili, and you're drinking something that feels more like a potion than a refreshment. It was a drink of function, not pleasure, designed to energize, sanctify, and occasionally intimidate. It didn't pamper, it punched, and everyone who mattered drank it that way. When the Spanish arrived and encountered cacao, they were confused but intrigued. At first, they found it foul. Then they realized it was valuable. And eventually, after enough experimentation, they sweetened it. They added cane sugar, cinnamon, and milk, all foreign ingredients. And in doing so, they changed the meaning of chocolate forever. What had once been a sacred Aztec ritual drink was transformed into a European luxury, stripped of its original context and dressed in lace and powdered sugar. But before it was wrapped in foil and sold in heart-shaped boxes, chocolate was power. It was wealth. It was religion in a cup, served with froth, chili, and occasionally a human heart beating somewhere nearby. It didn't need sweetness. It had symbolism. It didn't need marshmallows. It had muscle. And while you probably wouldn't want to drink it before bed, the Aztecs would have insisted that a true cup of cacao was good for the soul, assuming your stomach could handle it. To understand Aztec cuisine, you have to understand chilies, not as a seasoning, but as a worldview. In the Aztec Empire, chilies weren't an optional garnish sprinkled politely on top of food. They were foundational, fundamental, inescapable. They flavoured nearly every dish, dictated regional preferences, and even appeared in non-culinary places where, frankly, they had no business being, like child discipline and religious ritual. The chili was not merely an ingredient, it was a way of life, and occasionally a warning. Chili peppers came in dozens of varieties across the Aztec region. There were sharp green ones that delivered a quick sting, smoky reds that built heat like a slow-burning fire, and blackened, dried varieties that could be ground into dust and used to season everything, from stew to guilt. They were cultivated carefully, stored in great quantities, and categorized according to strength, color, and presumed emotional impact. A proper Aztec kitchen was stocked with more chilies than it was with actual food. You didn't plan a meal and then consider the spice. You picked the chili and then built the meal around what wouldn't die upon contact. In daily cuisine, chilies were everywhere. Beans and tortillas might seem plain, but not when laced with bright red sauce that could strip the moisture from your eyes. Stews weren't complete without at least 2 kinds of chili, and even tamales, those gentle steamed parcels of corn dough, were often stuffed with a chorus of molten pepper paste. There was talal chili, a kind of standard chili sauce used in home kitchens, and more elaborate varieties used by professional cooks in the markets or by priests preparing offerings. The result was a culinary culture where spice wasn't a bonus, it was the default setting. But chilies didn't stop at the dinner table. The Aztecs used them in medicine, punishment, purification, and ritual, often in ways that would land you in court today. One popular disciplinary method for misbehaving children involved placing them in a small enclosed hut, while dried chilies were burned nearby, flooding the space with acrid, eye-watering smoke. The experience was said to encourage reflection, repentance, and long-term avoidance of sass. This was not a mild parenting technique. It was essentially pepper spray as a lifestyle coach. No one forgot it. Chilies were also used in religious ceremonies. They might be offered to gods in bowls alongside flowers, feathers, and maize. They might be included in ritual food or mixed into drinks consumed before sacrifices. Some rituals used chili to induce altered states, not because the pepper was psychoactive, but because extreme heat can bring about a certain clarity of mind, especially when accompanied by coughing, sweating, and the sudden urge to reconsider your choices. In short, the gods liked things hot, and so did their priests. Medicinally, chilies were believed to have purifying and stimulating properties. They were used to treat stomach troubles, ward off colds, and act as a general purpose remedy for whatever the problem might be. Mixed with herbs or ground into paste, they were applied externally for aches or ingested as a form of preventative suffering. The theory being that if the chili didn't cure the illness, it at least distracted you from noticing it. And in many cases that seems to have worked. Chili also played a social role. The ability to handle heat was a point of pride, and those with a tolerance for strong chilies were seen as more robust, disciplined, or worthy. Guests might be offered spicy food not only as a test of hospitality, but as a quiet challenge. A strong reaction, watery eyes, coughing, or outright rejection, marked you as delicate. A calm acceptance, even with sweat pouring down your temples, earned silent respect. It wasn't just about taste, it was a measure of character. The cultivation of chilies was a serious business. They were grown in household gardens, traded in marketplaces, and even collected as tribute from outlying regions. Dried chilies were especially valuable as they could be stored, transported, and pulverized into seasoning or paste. Some types were so pungent they were used in ceremonial fires to purify temples or as deterrents against evil spirits or nosy neighbors. The Aztecs may not have had locks on their doors, but the right chili smoke could clear a street in under 5 minutes. Despite their prominence, chilies weren't used indiscriminately. Recipes were tailored carefully. Certain dishes called for specific types of pepper. Too much heat in the wrong context could be considered crude or even disrespectful, especially if the food was being prepared for a deity or a nobleman with delicate digestion. There was an art to chili use, not just how much, but when, where, and why. The difference between a brilliant meal and a weaponized stew was often a single dried pod. Even the Spanish, famously squeamish about Aztec culinary practices, couldn't deny the chili's appeal. They complained about the heat, yes, loudly and often, but they also took notes. Over time, chili peppers would spread across the globe, becoming essential in Indian curries, Thai stir-fries, Ethiopian stews, and southern hot sauces. But it started here, in the steaming kitchens of Tenochtitlan, where fire met flavour and never looked back. In the end, the chili wasn't just food, it was identity, ritual, medicine, and punishment. A single plant woven into every corner of Aztec life. Whether you were slurping it in a sacred broth, smearing it on an aching joint, or choking on it as a lesson in humility, one truth remained constant. The chili always made itself known. And in the Aztec Empire, that was precisely the point. If you didn't feel it, you probably weren't paying attention, and the chili would fix that for you. In the Aztec Empire, food didn't just fill stomachs, it sorted people. What you ate, how it was prepared, and whether it came with seasoning or ceremony was often less about personal taste and more about social rank. While commoners dined on what was available and sustainable, the elite dined on what was luxurious and symbolic. The difference between a peasant stew and a nobleman's banquet wasn't just ingredients. It was philosophy, status, and a deeply institutionalized sense of who deserved what. For the average citizen, meals were practical affairs. Tortillas, beans, chilies, and the occasional addition of squash or insect protein formed the daily menu. These were nutritious, filling, and produced with great effort, usually by women who ground maize at dawn, stirred pots over smoky fires, and rolled tortillas with calloused hands. The results were humble but effective. Energy for labour, warmth in the stomach, and just enough spice to keep things interesting. Meat, if it appeared at all, was often stringy, small and hard-earned. A few bites of frog, a roasted lizard, maybe some fish, or a lucky scrap of turkey bone. But in the palaces of the elite, food was performance. The Emperor Montezuma II, according to Spanish accounts that read like half-horrified admiration, was served as many as 300 dishes per meal. These weren't just variations on a theme, they were a parade of opulence, featuring rare meats, exotic spices, and artistic presentation. Montezuma ate behind a screen, attended by stewards who brought the dishes on individual platters, each one covered with cloth to preserve heat and mystery. He chose what he liked, took a few bites and moved on, not out of wastefulness but out of symbolic excess. The point wasn't to finish the food, the point was to show that he could. Nobles enjoyed similar, if slightly less theatrical privileges. Their meals featured things the commoners rarely saw: fresh turkey, tender rabbit, young duck, and white tortillas, made from finely ground, carefully selected maize. White tortillas were softer, milder, and aesthetically pleasing, and their consumption was often restricted by class. While the lower classes ate yellow or red tortillas, coarser and more common, the elite could afford the paler varieties pressed and cooked by expert hands. It was subtle culinary hierarchy, built right into the bread. Delicacies for the elite extended beyond meat. Escamoles, ant larvae harvested from agave roots, were a gourmet ingredient, creamy and nutty, and often wrapped in delicate tamales. Certain mushrooms, prized for flavour and occasional psychoactive properties, were gathered from forests and prepared with care. Cacao drinks, frothed to perfection and blended with spices or flower extracts, were offered at banquets. Not as desserts, but as symbols of power and sophistication. These were served in elaborately decorated vessels, the kind that might make a modern chocolate bar weep with inferiority. Food was also about ceremony. Elite households marked births, marriages, and religious festivals with elaborate feasts. These weren't casual gatherings. They were political theatre, spiritual duty, and culinary spectacle rolled into one. Guests were seated according to rank. Dishes were timed and spaced for maximum effect. Certain courses had ritual significance. Others were just there to impress. A well-thrown feast wasn't just remembered. It was retold, referenced, and quietly used to measure your standing among peers. To serve under-seasoned stew was a diplomatic misstep. To run out of tamales was social catastrophe. Behind these elegant meals was a labour force few saw. Cooks, stewards, and specialised food preparers, often women or lower status servants, spent hours grinding maize, roasting meat, plucking feathers, and arranging herbs. Their skill shaped the experience but earned little credit. The elite praised the dish, not the hands that prepared it. Recipes were passed down within noble houses, kept secret, or assigned to specific ritual occasions. Even among the privileged, food knowledge was power, and the best meals were closely guarded cultural capital. For the commoner, catching the scent of one of these meals from beyond a palace wall might have been both tantalising and pointless. Access was limited. Occasionally, festivals allowed for broader participation, and food was distributed to the masses, often symbolically, in small portions, as a gesture of goodwill or religious generosity. But regular access to elite ingredients or dishes? Unlikely. The average citizen knew of turkey but might rarely taste it. They saw cacao beans but didn't drink the sacred froth. They understood that white tortillas existed, but they cooked yellow ones because that's what grew nearby. This culinary divide wasn't accidental. It was structural, reinforced by tribute systems and class laws. Certain foods were taxed from outlying regions and directed straight into noble households or temple stores. Other ingredients were restricted, reserved for religious use, elite consumption, or imperial distribution. The economy of food reflected the economy of power. Your diet mirrored your role in society, right down to the colour of your bread and the spice in your sauce. Still, it wasn't all resentment and deprivation. Commoner cuisine had its own strengths, fresh, seasonal, and deeply local. People cooked what they grew, what they could afford, and what they knew how to use. They adapted, innovated, and made do with extraordinary creativity. The elite may have had the rarest ingredients, but the poor often had the most resourceful recipes. They couldn't waste. They had to make flavour from nothing, and they did. With chilies, herbs, bugs, and patience. In the end, the gap between elite and commoner meals was a gap of scale, not just quality. The rich had more variety, more meat, more extravagance, but they also had more pressure. Every dish was a statement. Every ingredient was a symbol. Every bite had an audience. The poor ate for survival. The nobles ate for legacy. And somewhere in the middle, over a warm tortilla and a bowl of seasoned beans, someone probably wondered what all the fuss was about. If everyday Aztec food was practical, festival food was theatrical. Across the empire's highly detailed calendar, dozens of religious festivals filled the year, and nearly all of them involved food. These weren't casual holidays with a few snacks on a table. They were full-scale ritual feasts, honouring specific gods with specific dishes, some of which were shaped like human beings, others made with symbolic ingredients, and a few that included substances modern food safety inspectors would rather not discuss. For the Aztecs, festivals were a time to eat with reverence, and just a hint of dread. Each of the Aztec calendar's 18 20-day months came with its own religious celebrations. Some were somber, some celebratory, and nearly all required the preparation of special foods. These dishes were designed not just for taste, but for meaning. They mimicked the forms of gods, symbolized aspects of the season, or reenacted creation myths in edible form. Often they were made with amaranth, a protein-rich seed that could be ground into flour, mixed with honey or maguey sap, and molded like clay. From this, the Aztecs sculpted gods, warriors, and ritual figures, which were paraded, blessed, and eventually broken apart and eaten by the crowd. It was equal parts snack and sacrament. Perhaps the most famous of these was bread of the dead, or rather its Aztec precursor. Modern pan de muerto, the sweet, fluffy loaf sold in Mexican bakeries today, traces its origin to pre-Columbian practices where dough was shaped into human figures. These weren't soft, sugar-dusted buns. They were dense, unsweetened offerings, closer to amaranth bricks than brioche, crafted to resemble specific deities or symbolic human forms. Some were decorated with seeds or coloured dyes. Others were pierced with sticks or arranged in poses, reenacting stories from the mythological past. A few, according to Spanish accounts, were sprinkled with the ashes of sacrificial victims. Nothing says celebration quite like a light dusting of cremated bone. These edible effigies were not merely festive. They were ritual tools. The act of shaping, cooking, offering, and consuming them was a symbolic cycle. Creation, destruction, renewal, all folded into a tamale or moulded into a crunchy little god. The food wasn't just eaten, it was sacrificed, honoured, and shared, often accompanied by incense, song, and processions where people wore costumes, danced through the streets, and carried trays of what looked like baked children. No one batted an eye, it was tradition. Other festivals focused on the seasonal bounty. The Feast of Xilunen, for instance, celebrated the young maize goddess. People created altars of fresh corn, offered tamales filled with green vegetables, and performed rituals to ensure a good harvest. The food was simple but symbolic: young corn, fresh herbs, and dishes flavoured with hope. In contrast, the festival of Tlacaxi-Pehuelistli, dedicated to the god Xipe-Totec, who wore the flayed skin of a sacrificed man, involved more unsettling fare. Human-shaped dough was again on the menu, and some accounts suggest that real human skin, removed in a ritual sacrifice, may have been worn by priests as part of the feast. Whether or not it ended up in the stew remains unclear, and probably for the best. Feasts during festivals were community events, blending sacred ritual with social bonding. Temples distributed food to the people, often in large open plazas, where bowls of maize, beans, and chili-laced stews were handed out in exchange for participation, prayers, or simple proximity. Families contributed what they could. Nobles sponsored elaborate banquets. The emperor, if he was involved, might oversee a feast that spanned days, requiring an army of cooks, stewards, and ritual performers. Everyone ate, from the highest-ranking priest to the barefoot farmer, though what they ate, and how much of it, still reflected their place in society. And the gods, of course, ate first. Offerings of food were presented before altars, burned, buried, or placed on ceremonial dishes and left for divine inspection. Some offerings were consumed by fire, others were simply allowed to rot, a sign that the gods had spiritually absorbed the meal and left behind the shell. Priests oversaw these rituals, sometimes tasting the food themselves, other times simply watching as symbolic portions were prepared with ingredients so precise that even the wrong number of chili seeds could offend the divine palate. Even drink had its moment in these celebrations. Pulak, a mildly alcoholic, milky beverage made from fermented maguey sap, flowed freely at many festivals, but with limitations. It was allowed for the elderly, the priests, and those performing rituals. For others, drunkenness was considered shameful unless it was sanctioned by a religious calendar. Still, during the right festivals, the rules relaxed. Ritual intoxication became a tool for transcendence, or, depending on the observer, a brief and sacred excuse to fall face first into your neighbour's squash stew. What's remarkable is how seamlessly the culinary and the cosmic merged. Food was not just sustenance, it was theology. Every bite during a festival was part of a larger system of belief, reaffirming connections to gods, seasons, ancestors, and social order. You weren't just eating a tamale, you were participating in a reenactment of creation, honouring a harvest, or internalising the spirit of a deity moulded in dough. And occasionally, you were also testing your gag reflex on an offering that included a little more ash than advertised. These festivals, far from being macabre oddities, were central to Aztec life. They brought people together, reinforced collective memory, and reminded everyone, rich or poor, priest or peasant, that the gods had to be fed before anyone else. Preferably with something handmade, symbolically accurate, and just human-shaped enough to get the point across. The arrival of the Spanish in the early 16th century marked the beginning of many things, none of them good for the Aztecs. Among the gifts brought by Hernán Cortés and his well-fed, armour-clanking entourage were steel weapons, aggressive Christianity, a collection of diseases that made smallpox look polite, and a completely different approach to food. The Spanish did not come with curiosity. They came with a menu, and the moment they looked at Aztec cuisine, they decided it was wrong. From the Spanish perspective, Aztec food was equal parts fascinating and horrifying. They were dazzled by the markets of Tenochtitlan, where thousands of vendors sold a dizzying array of produce, meats, herbs, and insects arranged with military precision. They were amazed by the efficiency of the chinampas, by the piles of ripe avocados, and the steaming tamales served with sauces as complex as any European ragu. And then they noticed the human limbs in the stew and decided, perhaps too quickly, that the entire culture needed replacing. To be fair, it wasn't just the cannibalism. The Spanish were scandalized by the lack of bread, wine, pork, and cheese, the cornerstones of their own diet, and in their minds, the only acceptable things to consume if you wanted to be civilized and not struck by lightning. Aztec food lacked these sacred staples, and instead offered roasted salamanders, spicy chocolate, and tortillas that, while functional, didn't resemble real bread in the spiritual or digestive sense. It didn't help that the Aztecs didn't drink wine, used chili in everything, and occasionally shaped their festival bread into screaming gods. As the conquest unfolded, Spanish disgust transformed into something more permanent: culinary colonialism. Pigs, goats, cows, and chickens were brought over by ship, snorting their way into the New World, alongside armed men and confused missionaries. These animals reproduced quickly, sometimes faster than the remaining native populations. Pork, especially, took hold like a culinary parasite. Fatty, familiar, and easier to chew than iguana, pig meat began appearing in local dishes, eventually replacing traditional proteins like turkey, dog, and amphibian. It was a slow takeover, not just of land, but of lunch. Cheese soon followed, introduced by Spanish settlers, who couldn't imagine life without dairy, and who, in typical colonial fashion, decided that if milk wasn't already being used, the locals must have been doing it wrong. Never mind that the Aztecs had no large domesticated animals, no tradition of dairy, and likely no desire to store something that spoiled in less than a day. Cheese was foreign, heavy, and utterly unnecessary. It also became popular almost immediately. Salted and preserved, it added richness to tamales and tortillas, changing their texture and taste forever. Onions, garlic, wheat, citrus, all poured in over time, carried in cargo holds, and woven into recipes through sheer persistence. Where Aztec dishes had once relied on local herbs and native plants, they were now increasingly flavoured with European imports. Wheat tortillas slowly appeared beside maize ones. Lard replaced ground squash seed in sauces. Even cacao was sweetened, stripped of its bitter ceremonial bite, and turned into a colonial luxury item. The Spanish called it chocolate, added sugar, and served it with milk, a complete inversion of its original purpose. The gods, one imagines, were not amused. Of course, the feeling was mutual. The Aztecs were just as horrified by Spanish eating habits. They considered cheese disgusting, milk unnatural, and the Spanish obsession with bread both bland and puzzling. The meat-heavy Spanish diet, soaked in grease and devoid of spice, struck them as heavy-handed and spiritually off-kilter. Where was the corn? Where were the chilies? Why was everything so wet and yet somehow dry at the same time? For a people who had turned cuisine into cosmic balance, the Spanish diet seemed like an insult to both stomach and soul. But colonialism doesn't ask permission, and soon Aztec food began to fracture under pressure. Some traditions disappeared entirely, not just because of Spanish intolerance, but because the societal structures that supported them had been dismantled. Ritual foods tied to temple offerings vanished as temples burned. Ingredients once gathered communally for festivals became scarce or forbidden. The suppression of religious practices extended to cuisine, and the more symbolic a dish was, the more likely it was to be banned, forgotten, or reinvented under a Catholic pretense. At the same time, new hybrid dishes began to emerge. Indigenous ingredients met Spanish ones in awkward but creative combinations. Maize tortillas filled with pork, tamales with cheese and olives, mole sauces thickened with almonds, and spiced with imported cinnamon. Over generations, these blends would come to define Mexican cuisine, a complex, layered fusion, born from both violence and adaptation. But in the early days of conquest, it was mostly confusion, resentment, and a lot of bad digestion. Cortés may have claimed the land for Spain, but his legacy is written just as clearly in the frying pan. The replacement of traditional Aztec ingredients with European imports wasn't just culinary evolution. It was cultural erasure, masked by gravy. And while some foods survived, maize, beans, squash, chilies, they were reshaped, renamed, and recontextualized under a new regime that saw food not as sacred, but as something to be dominated, renamed, and fed back to its creators, with a garnish of condescension. And so the Aztec kitchen changed. It became a space of compromise, part resistance, part reinvention. The old gods no longer ate first. The dough figures shaped like deities disappeared, replaced by bread shaped like saints. Stews no longer contained arms, just pork. Chocolate no longer made you jittery and righteous. It made you sleepy and sentimental. And tortillas, though still everywhere, now shared the table with bread baked in ovens the Aztecs never asked for. The Aztec Empire is long gone. Its temples are in ruins, its gods reduced to footnotes in dusty textbooks, and its warriors now remembered mostly through murals and museum exhibits. But its food, some of it anyway, survived. Not unchanged, and certainly not unscarred, but still present in quiet ways. You can find its remnants in the tamales sold from street carts in Mexico City, in a cup of spiced hot chocolate served during a winter holiday, or in the complex, slow-simmered sauce known as mole. These dishes are echoes of an empire that was devoured, both figuratively and sometimes quite literally, but not entirely erased. Tamales are perhaps the most visible holdover from Aztec cuisine. They've changed, of course. The fillings are different. The lard is new. The Spanish brought pigs, and pigs brought fat, and fat brought a softness and richness the Aztecs would have found decadent, maybe even suspicious. But the structure remains. Maize dough wrapped in leaves, steamed until fragrant and warm. This is a direct line from ancient kitchens to modern hands. The ingredients may have shifted, but the ritual of it, the wrapping, the steaming, the sharing, still carries a trace of something older than colonialism, something sacred. Chocolate too made the leap from ritual to routine, though it had to pass through a transformation chamber of European preferences first. The original Aztec drink, bitter, spicy, frothed by hand, has little in common with what now lines supermarket shelves. Sugar, milk, and industrial processing have smoothed its rough edges. But cacao itself remains a gift from Mesoamerica to the world, and every time someone bites into a bar or stirs cocoa into milk, they're participating, however unknowingly, in a culinary tradition that once required both ceremony and courage. And then there's mole. Not the animal, but the sauce, a thick, velvety blend of chilies, spices, seeds, and sometimes chocolate, stirred slowly and obsessively until it becomes a glossy pool of layered complexity. Mole is the poster child for cultural fusion. It's part Aztec, part Spanish, part whatever, happened in the centuries between conquest and cuisine. It's not ancient exactly, but it's deeply rooted. And like the empire that birthed some of its components, it demands time, patience, and a strong stomach. Other dishes survived in fragments. Atole, the maize-based drink, is still consumed, though now flavoured with cinnamon and sugar instead of chili and ash. Escamoles, ant larvae, are still eaten, but more as gourmet novelty than daily fare. Pulque remains available in some regions, though it's been largely overshadowed by tequila and beer. Amaranth, once sacred and essential, has returned as a health food, packaged in resealable bags and marketed for protein content rather than cosmic symbolism. Some ingredients vanished, while others were repackaged with labels that smoothed over their more unsettling pasts. Of course, some things didn't survive at all, not because they weren't good, but because they were too closely tied to rituals the colonizers didn't tolerate. You won't find edible dough gods at your local bakery. No one's serving tlacatlaoli, the human flesh stew described in early Spanish chronicles. There are no festive breads sprinkled with ash from sacrificial fires, no public feasts honouring Shipe Totec with skin masks and communal tamales. These dishes didn't just fall out of favour, they were actively erased, their ingredients and meanings forbidden, their recipes turned into rumours. And yet, despite the erasure, something remained. The logic of the cuisine, the way Aztec cooks balanced heat, texture, and sustenance with whatever the land could provide, still echoes in modern Mexican food. There's a reason it tastes so layered, so alive. It's built on a foundation that predates European arrival by centuries. That doesn't make it pure, it makes it resilient. The Aztecs didn't just cook to eat, they cooked to communicate with each other, with the gods, with the seasons, and with the world around them. That kind of intention leaves a flavour that lingers. In many ways, the story of Aztec cuisine is the story of survival through adaptation. The empire fell, its temples toppled, its priests executed or forcibly converted. But maize kept growing, chilies kept burning, markets kept trading, and people kept cooking, not in the same way, not with the same meaning, but with enough memory to carry a little of the old world into the new. The sacred was replaced with the secular. The ritual became habit. But the food remained, changed, softened, sometimes sweetened, but still bearing the DNA of a civilization that once fed both gods and people with equal care. Today, chefs and food historians are working to recover parts of that lost culinary world. Not the cannibalism, thankfully, but the ingredients, the techniques, the philosophy behind the meals. They're planting native varieties of maize, rediscovering amaranth, experimenting with traditional chili blends, and trying to understand what it meant to eat in a world where every bite was a transaction with the cosmos. It's not about going backward, it's about remembering that the past is still edible if you know where to look. So if you ever find yourself holding a warm tamale or sipping a cup of bitter hot chocolate, take a moment. Somewhere beneath the flavour is a story. A long, tangled one, filled with empires, invasions, rituals, and recipes. It's not a clean story. It's not always a pleasant one, but it's real, and it tastes like survival. And that's the end of tonight's journey through the bizarre, brilliant, and occasionally unsettling world of Aztec cuisine. From floating gardens to sacred stew, from chili smoke punishments to chocolate that bites back. The Aztecs cooked with purpose, even if that purpose sometimes made your eyes water. Thanks for drifting through history with me. If you're still awake, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about which ancient dish you'd be brave enough to try. Sleep well, and maybe skip the tamales for breakfast.